In the third section of our grief counseling course material, I'd like to talk to you about the different types of grief. Not all grief is the result of the same circumstance. We've already talked about that. It could be the loss of life. It could be the loss of a job, a loss of a spouse. Different kinds of loss will result in grief. And so since they're not all the result of the same circumstance, it's going to be helpful for us to recognize some of the different types of grief in order to sufficiently empathize with those who suffer. Depending on the particular guides which are referenced, the onset of loss can be classified in a multitude of different ways. Wayne E. Oates provides an overview of 5 different types of grief, and he notes that the pastor is most effective when he discerns the different kinds of grief. Different forms of grief call for different kinds of diagnosis, meaning, and treatment. A summary of these observations is going to be really helpful for us so that we can treat and meet people where they're at in their grief process. So the first one that we want to talk about is called anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the type of grief that is the proverbial double-edged sword. It's most commonly seen in the double sense of grief over a person who is dying with a terminal illness. It's a double sense of grief in that there is both the grieving over the sense of the gradual loss of life and function, as well as the grief of the family and friends who are close to the dying person. In this type of grief, the counselor is called to comfort both the dying and those who struggle in watching the dying process. To many, the gradual decline into certain death is more difficult to bear than the actual death itself. After all, it does take a lot longer. It is not uncommon that to have a sense of mixed emotions in the survivors after a long and often prolonged death. In general, there is a common sigh of relief when finally the dying is released from the prison of their sickly body. And as pastors, we spend a great deal of time in hospitals with people, some who are dying, who are members of our congregation, others who maybe are related to those in our congregation, or that we meet through some contact in the community. And we know how difficult it is to be in there and be a part of that dying process. No one who's dying particularly grasps onto the idea right away that they are going to die, and they just jump on board and everything's all right. They fight, they struggle, they say they're going to hang on. There's a common belief that they're going to beat this thing and that they are going to be that 1% that overcomes all odds and goes on into life. And while we would certainly pray for some of those things, the reality of our day is that many that go through this, the majority actually, do pass away and go off to be with the Lord. And so this kind of anticipatory grief is like, we know there's a grief coming. We're anticipating that grief. And it's for the dying person, it's anticipating the struggle or the journey that they're going to go on. Sometimes doctors give patients 3 months or 6 months or a year, and usually those are best guesses and they're not really accurate. But we do know from those kind of guesses that there is going to be a process involved. And then when we're talking about the family of a person who's going to go through that process, well, they've got the kind of double grief of seeing this person who's going through this process and also dealing with their own grief over the loss of this person, the loss of their relationship with them, humanly speaking. So anticipatory grief is a very tricky thing, and we need to recognize that and understand that if someone is diagnosed, that there is a need for counseling, whether it's formal or informal, to not only the person who is passing along, but also to the family as well. This is a very good tool for counselors, biblical counselors and pastoral counselors especially, to get involved with the lives of people and soothe the hit as it looks as it's coming. The next kind of grief that I'd like to briefly touch upon is called acute grief or sudden grief. This type of grief strikes with little or no warning. Death often comes suddenly and unexpectedly, as in the case of a severe heart attack, an accident, suicide, a murder, or some other kind of tragedy. And typically the survivors initially enter a state of shock, which may cause them to enter into a hyperactive mode in which they seem to be all business and very little reality. In other cases, the survivors can be stunned into denial and disbelief. And in extreme cases, a survivor may suffer from a psychotic break or what was once called a nervous breakdown, which may require short-term medication or even hospitalization. It will be helpful to remember that those who are in a state of shock are irrational, sometimes appearing as in a zombie-like state. The counselor's presence is particularly important through this initial phase because the shock will wear off, but depending on the severity of the death, it may take as much as a few days for it to wear off and them to come out of it. In the case of acute grief, the pastor can do much to prevent the situation from spiraling downward when the shock wears off. Working to ensure that the survivor is not left alone is critical in the initial phase of acute grief. Mobilizing the church community to provide prayer and also for meals and care is critical, as well as visitations if possible. Oates notes in his book that persons suffering from a sudden loss are more likely to become pathologically bereaved than is a person suffering anticipatory grief. The latter grieves in installments over a preparatory period of time. A sudden bereavement comes more as a thief in the night and has more damaging psychological as well as physiological effects. Now let's talk just a little bit about this so we can give a kind of a background. Anticipatory grief is one thing, but acute or sudden grief is something that we deal with more often. I remember a case in our church where there was an elderly couple who were in good health, who were very active in the community. They lived on their own in their own home. They kept their home and kept the lawn up and were out the church all the time and doing well. And one particular afternoon, the husband gave his wife a kiss on the cheek as he was going to go down into the basement and work on some things. He kissed her, said, "I love you," and he went downstairs, and by the time he got to the bottom stair, he had died. Just a sudden heart attack right out of nowhere. And when I first came to meet with the family following that sudden death, they were in a state of shock. It was just like they were focused on the funeral. They had to get everything done. Everything had to be in order. And they weren't ready to process their feelings. They weren't really even ready to discuss it. It was a major shock to them, but it was as if it had happened to someone else. And they were just going through the motions of taking care of business. In a few days, usually coming up to after the funeral, there is a sudden realization that sets in, and that can be a devastating time in the life of a person. So we have to be careful with that. I want to talk about the effects of shock and acute or sudden grief syndrome, going back to the case that we've been talking about throughout the course. Now, when this young girl was killed in the campground and I was called to the hospital, when I arrived in the hospital, it was a scene that I will never forget. The mother and the father were sitting in a private room. There were police outside of the door. The hospital attendants quickly rushed us in, and the police filled us in that the child had died, and they had been in there some time, and they were waiting to see me, and that the child was with them. And so they gave us some time and told me to take my time and talk to them. And when I went in, the precious little girl's body was wrapped up in a blanket, and the mom was kind of just holding her and cuddling her and speaking to her, and she was clearly in a state of shock. This was a traumatic case of acute and sudden grief because this was just a terrible, instantaneous, senseless accident that cost this girl who was 2.5 years old her life, and it was devastating for her parents. Her father, his shirt was covered with blood, and he was in a state of shock as well. He had been the first to respond to the accident. And when I entered into the room with my wife and we were there to comfort them and help them, they weren't sure what to do. They were in kind of almost like, if you would use the term, a zombie-like state. It was absolute shock. They were in shock. In fact, later on when we left the hospital, we would not allow them to drive because they were just in complete shock. And this went on for a little while. Especially the mom had a really hard time. And we talked about how the survivors can be stunned into denial and disbelief, or in extreme cases, a survivor might suffer from a psychotic break. And we once might have called those nervous breakdowns. But a psychotic break is a break off or a ceasing to comprehend reality. And as the funeral and the arrangements started to proceed, and I was in close contact with the mother and father, the mother was not sleeping. She was in a hyperactive state, and she would be up all night and writing emails and just very busy with things, and we're not all even sure all the things that she was busy doing, but she floated into that state, and then she seemed to be having some viewpoints that didn't make a lot of sense when the little child was going to be buried, going to have the funeral for her. They determined that the funeral would be set up almost like a party. There were balloons and there was upbeat music playing in the funeral parlor, and the child was in sleepwear in the casket and with teddy bears and things, and this was all that was determined by the mom. She really needed these things, and there was some difficulty, and she had suffered from some hallucinations, which was probably brought on by the lack of sleep as well as the shock that was happening in the psychotic break. But she started to hallucinate very vividly, and she made it all the way through the funeral, and we had gone to the gravesite, and when we came back for the reception, she simply collapsed right in the parking lot. As soon as we got out of the car, it was over. That seems to be the point when the shock ended, and she had what we would call a nervous breakdown. After several days of being in her home by herself, she eventually did have to be hospitalized, and that was a very traumatic experience also for the family and everybody who was involved, and it was very difficult. And I can tell you, being very frank and being very honest, that in all the years of ministry, that has been the most difficult death that I have ever had to face. And I have been called upon to have funeral services for babies that were stillborn who have only lived 7 or 8 minutes outside of the womb, or for young people who have died tragically, and for older people who are well beloved in the community. And I can say, well, beyond any question, that was the most difficult time in ministry for me as I was helping these people and trying to cope with my own grief. Because this was a little girl who had grown up in our church, and I had known her since she was a baby. And that struck me as being very difficult as well. We loved this little girl. She was a beautiful, sweet girl. And it was tough for us. But as you know, as pastors and counselors, we we cannot be selfish in that time. We have to continue to function and help. But it is important that we have other pastors, friends and peers and colleagues who we can trust, who we can call and share the burden of our heart. And I had several friends that I was able to call at that time, and many of the pastors in my peer group or fellows that know me called up because they had heard this tragic news, and just to comfort and encourage me. And I tell you, that meant the world to me at that time. Without that strength and that prayer support behind me and the Lord's grace, I don't think I would have made it through that funeral. But God was good, and we did have a time of celebration of her brief life, and the hope and the knowledge that she is in glory with the Lord in a place that is far better. And it was a long road. We'll talk probably more about that as we move through the course material. There's a lot that you can do to stop a person who's suffering from a case of that acute grief or that sudden grief from spiraling out of control. Being in close communication with them, gauging how they are. Are they in touch with reality? Are they saying things that are concerning you? Are they making decisions that are irrational? Often when somebody faces a loss, they start to just rifle off irrational decisions. I remember in my life when my grandmother died, the first thing my grandfather said was, "I'm selling the house." He didn't take time to weep. He didn't comfort his children. He just blurted out, "I'm selling the house." And that's just kind of a response reaction that you get when you're in a sudden state of shock and disbelief. It's amazing what the mind produces in those times. And so, friends, we have to be very careful that we take everything that is said immediately with a grain of salt. They might express anger. They might express disbelief. They might express any set of emotions. And it's not for us to judge or to respond necessarily to the emotional feedback that comes out. It's for us to just kind of be there share and absorb it and understand and comfort them as best we can. Acute or sudden onset or sudden grief is a very tricky one, but it's the one I think we're probably most familiar with. Chronic sorrow or no-end grief is drastically different from anticipatory and acute grief. Chronic sorrow occurs in the sense of living with a long-term process, such as living with a badly deformed or mentally handicapped child, or caring for a spouse with Alzheimer's disease, or married to a person who is serving a life sentence. This kind of grief is a long-term grief. It's a long-term issue with no clear end in sight. Some people have called this the death of a dream, wherein the typical thoughts and plans for future normalcy are taken from a person who finds themselves suddenly in a prison of care for another person. We all have an idea in our minds, or even in our just imaginations, of how we would like our lives to be. We like to picture ourselves with our spouses in our golden years, maybe sitting on the porch and rocking back and forth in our old age with young children running around us. But the truth is, in this life, there are no guarantees. In our current section on the different types of grief, I'll direct your attention to the fourth type, which is called near-miss grief. Near-miss grief results in a person who has narrowly escaped death, such as a soldier who has survived and whose friends did not. This type of grief causes what is also called survivor guilt. Other scenarios in which this type of grief can occur are those such as the sole survivor of an automobile accident or in the survivors of a terrorist attack. Near-miss grief can be chronically traumatic and is perhaps most related to post-traumatic stress disorder, which, if you look in your textbooks at some time, Caring for People God's Way, there is an entire section in there that's a really good section on post-traumatic stress disorder. And that near-miss grief, you hear that sometimes in the very unfortunate event where there is an accident involving children and one child dies and the other child lives, and the child gets that idea that it should have been me, or because they see their parents' grief and they kind of internalize that and think that their parents aren't happy that they're alive, and so they misunderstand a lot of the times, and they get that near-miss grief that can really affect them. Others who have survived in accidents and friends did not, they go through the same kind of mental anguish, and so we need to be aware of that type of grief as well. The next one, pathological grief, is a complicated one because it takes on many forms. The most common symptom is when the shock of a sudden death unhinges the judgment and behavior of a severely shocked family or person. In his book, Oates gives the following example. This is a quote: "The most obvious one is how bizarre the grieving is. I think of a father whose 26-year-old son was killed in an automobile accident. In the hospital emergency room, the father asked if his body could be stuffed the way that a taxidermist would do for a bird or an animal. And when he was told that this was impossible, he had his son embalmed, placed in a casket sealed as tight as possible with a glass cover on it so that his body could be seen. The casket was placed in an air-conditioned room in his home. He began to invite ministers to come by and lead worship services in the room where the casket was." And that is bizarre, and that's the end of the quote. So there are ways in which this pathological grief, this ongoing and continual grief, can really cause people to do strange things. Pathological grief most often stems from long-term personality issues which have been part of a person's history before, during, and long after a death, divorce, or other such loss. Some of these personality issues, some of these issues that were pre-existent come kind of to the front of the personality, and that can cause significant other problems as professionals try to figure out what the best way is to help somebody through these things. The dependent personality type will respond with helplessness. The antisocial personality type will tend to act out in rage or try to manipulate God or other people. And the borderline personality will make repeated suicide attempts and need periodic hospitalizations. And one of the most important things that we have to be aware of when we're helping someone who may have pathological grief in their life is that we need to understand where our job as a counselor ends and where the job of the medical doctors, the medical profession, begins. In the case that we have been sharing through this, when the mother of that young girl who was tragically killed was trying to cope with this. She went through several stages of difficulty. She was not sleeping, she was not eating, she was not moving, she was only having very brief periods of lucidity, and eventually she started to hallucinate. Now, not eating and not sleeping and those kinds of things can also cause a person to have hallucinations, but the depth of her grief was so much that she was saying some very troubling things to her family and to myself and to others. And at one point, she called to let me know that she had seen her young daughter in the tree in her backyard, in the tree with Jesus, and she saw them, and they were there, and there was a message for her, and this was very troubling for the family as they helped her kind of go through this. And well, in her case, there wasn't a lot of help at that time. We were still working through the funeral arrangements, and then some of those ideas from those periods where she wasn't quite thinking clearly kind of did come through in the funeral as well, and that can be a difficult thing in addition to the death. When you have a funeral that's kind of set up strangely, the child was laid into the casket wearing her pajamas, there were balloons, it was set up as a kind of a birthday party almost, and there was very upbeat music playing, toys all over the bottom of the casket and around in the room. There were kids that were playing. It was very strange. And that all stems from the idea of this pathological grief, this deep-set grief that maybe brought some things to the surface that had been there for a while. And I can tell you that to this day, which would be a couple years after the fact, she's doing much better, and a lot of those earlier issues are now being dealt with, and things are going well. But in those initial stages, you really have to be careful, and you really have to understand things like dehydration and malnutrition and insomnia, chronic insomnia. These things can cause a person to demonstrate very strange behaviors, and they're not medically safe. And we're likely, us counselors, our pastoral counselors, are not medical doctors, and we have to know and have the wisdom to determine when a medical doctor is needed. So pathological grief is a very tricky one, and it may require periodic hospitalizations. And friends, there is nothing wrong with a person who might need to go into hospital for a week or two to just kind of let things sort out. Hospitals are very quiet places for the most part. Maybe different medications might need to be tried in order to help this person who's not sleeping. They might need to give them a sleeping aid, not eating. They might need to have to put an IV in for a while if they're severely dehydrated and they're not responding to people, telling them to drink and take care of themselves in that sense. So we have to know as counselors when it's time to get the medical community involved, and sometimes that is very quickly, and sometimes that comes after a period of time when you're finding out these things. And so part of counseling is to ask those very basic questions. And when we're dealing with somebody who's in a grief situation or grieving over a loss of any kind, probably those first questions that I ask them are things like, are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you getting enough to drink? Are you exercising? Not going to the gym necessarily, but are you walking around? Are you mobile? And if they are sleeping, they say, yes, I'm sleeping. I'll ask them, how long are you sleeping? Are you getting a full 8 hours, or at least as much sleep as you used to get before whatever incident caused them to have their grief? And so we have to be wise about those things and ask those questions so that these things don't kind of slip under the radar. And we know the basics of it. We don't have to be medical doctors to understand that a person needs somewhere around 8 hours of sleep a night. They need to be drinking 8 cups of water. They need to be mobile, moving around. And if a person is not eating and not sleeping and not moving around, there is a serious problem which could lead to medical complications. And so we have to be responsible in that sense to ask those questions. And if those questions or those needs aren't being fulfilled, we will need to involve the rest of the family to make sure that that person's physical health is being taken care of, even as we're trying to help them through their heartbreak of the loss. Pastoral care of the pathologically bereaved should be conducted in union with a mental health professional. And we're talking about a person who has had some kind of existing problem prior to the loss, and now they are pathologically grieving. We need to understand that mental health professionals are there to help. Not every one of them wants to put somebody on pills for the rest of their lives. Not every one of them wants to tell you to blame everything that happens in your life on your mother. Some are very caring professionals who understand. In fact, I have known several Christian psychiatrists, and they do a very good job in what they do. They don't. The one I'm thinking of in particular, who works out of St. Thomas, London area, he does not recommend long, extended periods of dosages of medications, but especially when it's related to grief. But he does understand, and we should understand as well, that when there is a massive loss or some kind of a pathological mourning cycle, sometimes the medications that we have can help to get us calmed down and bring us back on track. And so, especially in cases of suicide attempts, severe personality disorders, and the need for hospitalization is very apparent. And again, as counselors, I hope we all understand that when somebody is making a suicide claim or claiming to be preparing to commit suicide, we have to take that very seriously. And if we ignore that, or we try to, massage that bruise and not do anything about it, and the person does go on and does kill themselves, not only is that a great burden of guilt for us to bear, but there could be other repercussions as well. So we need to take those attempts seriously, those not attempts, but those threats seriously. And then, of course, a suicide attempt needs to be taken very seriously. And we are responsible to call the police department if we believe that there is an attempt happening. If a person calls you and says, I am going to kill myself, and you ask them, well, what do you mean you're going to kill yourself? What are you doing? Where are you right now? You've got to get those questions in first. If they say, I'm going to take a bunch of these pills or I'm going to hang myself, you need to immediately call the police with the address that that person is at and send them over so that that person can be rescued. And it doesn't even matter if later on down the road you find out it was an empty threat. You must take every threat seriously. You can't just say this is a person who's just talking to hear themselves. If they threaten to harm themselves or someone else, you must get proper authorities involved. Especially for those who have had suicide attempts in the past that you know of. Others who have the personality disorders and have had to work with psychiatrists in the past, who have some kind of, if there is some kind of a problem with which they have been dealing with over the years and they're taking medication for, you have to be aware of those things. And again, in your counseling intake forms, there are questions there about what medications are you taking, and you probably won't understand what the medication is. There are some very common forms of medication, serotonin inhibitors, serotonin uptakes, things like that you'll get familiar with. It's good if you're able to have an open conversation with a medical doctor that you do know, that you're able to say, can you tell me what this pill does? Even if you don't do that, you can also call if you don't have that relationship with a doctor, you can also call a pharmacy, and a pharmacy would be glad to tell you what a certain pill does or what it's for, and then only the person can really tell you what their medical professional thought when they were giving them, or what the reasoning behind was for that. And I think it's important that we as counselors don't overstep into the medical field and say, well, you shouldn't be taking any of these medications because it's not something that you need, because we don't know that, and we don't know maybe some of the details of their personality or their past that the doctors do know that they've shared with them, that their family has shared with the doctor as well. So we need to work kind of in conjunction with them, and we're talking here about a person who's in a pathological grieving cycle, not somebody who for no reason shows up in our office. So we have to understand that, and there can be repercussions if we don't. An example that I give in the course notes is this: demanding or coercing the patient or family to rely upon the sole care of the pastor may result in accidental death, successful suicide, and it could also result in legal action. This liability was dramatically exemplified with the Nally case against the pastors of a church in California, when a young adult entered their care for counseling and then later committed suicide. They had failed to seek psychiatric consultation or referral to a medical professional or a safeguard referral, and they were sued, and successfully sued, I believe. So we have to be very careful about these things. When we take on that role of counselor, again, remembering those kind of warning signs that we talked about in the earlier sections about the pastor. You can't have a Messiah complex. You can't think that you have every answer to every problem. You can't discount the need that some people may have for medications. So we have to be very careful on that and know our limits. Finally, the sixth sense is what we call the tragic sense of life. The tragic sense of life, grief, a kind of grief, arises from the sense of being limited in our care of others and in the sense of being subject to death ourselves. This tragic sense of life, intensely present in pastors, physicians, nurses, emergency workers, and medical teams, is just the fact that we see a lot of death. We see a lot of those who are sick and who are struggling with their health and then who do die. And this can be very difficult for us as counselors and us as pastors as well. Physicians, nurses, emergency workers, medical teams, they can go through this themselves. For the pastor, the tragic sense of life kind of goes with the territory. We spend our time and our energy and our talents working with people in crisis. And even though we spend much of our time experiencing the joy of life with people, and certainly the joy of salvation with people, we spend much time also walking with them through the lonely valley. And as we may go through periods of continual loss with those who suffer, we might find ourselves grieving in the sense that life is so tragic. I can tell you that in my present pastorate, in the first, I believe it was the first 2 years of ministry, we had 11 funerals. And it was insane. It was, and the funerals were of all kinds. I mean, we had a child that was tragically killed in a vehicle accident or run over by a vehicle that we've been talking about. We had a child that was born and lived for 5 minutes outside of the womb and died. We had a fellow who was, I believe, somewhere in his early 70s, and he had a heart attack, and then a year later his wife died. And so we've buried couples, we've buried children, we've buried singles, we've been involved in this. And there does come a sort of feeling when you're going through a stretch like that life is full of tragedy. When you're spending more time in the hospital room than you are in your study, and you're spending more time writing funerals than you are writing Bible studies, it can really get to you. And we have to be careful that we don't let that feeling of the tragic sense of life overwhelm us. And so it's of critical importance that we have a personal resource to lean on during our times of the tragic sense of life. As once it has been well said, every Paul needs a Barnabas. Never forget, in those dark days when those circumstances of life feel overwhelming to you, and there is not anyone to talk to, that we also have an incredible resource in the Spirit of God. We always have the Lord that we can speak to. And I'm not saying go to the Lord only and don't ever talk to anybody else about it. I think that's foolishness. I believe that even in the independent Baptist circles, I think one of the greatest problems that has resulted in pastors being stressed out and burning out and having these kinds of issues is that we don't have enough of fellowship in the peer group, that we don't have those men that we can talk to, that you can call on the phone and say, I'm struggling through something and I'm really hurting right now and I need that encouragement. And I believe it is a responsibility of pastors to have an accountability partner. And we don't like to hear about accountability partners, but it's something that's very important in this day and age, especially as we look at the decline of the world, how sin is just ramping up, how many of our churches are really struggling and suffering, and you have people problems within the church and problems within your own life, and then you're spending all this time at the hospital or in the funeral home, and you just get this sense of tragedy. You have to have a resource, a person that you can talk to, who you can trust. And men, I hope that we are that person for somebody else. We need to be able to keep confidences. We need to be able to speak without judgment of each other. We need to be able to hear a person's problem without becoming high and mighty because we don't have the same kind of problem. And we need to be a resource that can counsel one another as we seek to counsel each other. And we also have the Lord, of course. And what will we do without the Lord? How in the world could we cope with the tragedy of life if we didn't have the Lord Jesus? Remember Romans chapter 8, verses 26 to 27. The Bible says, likewise the Spirit also helpeth our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. And he that searcheth the hearts knoweth what is the mind of the Spirit, because he maketh intercession for the saints according to the will of God. So we have this wonderful gift of the indwelling Spirit of God, who prays for us in those times that we don't even know what to pray about. And he prays for us with groanings that cannot be uttered to the Father. And he is our great intercessor here on the earth. He is sealed within us until the day of redemption, and he is always with us. And of course, the Lord Jesus promised he would never leave us or forsake us, not even to the end of the world. And so we have him as a resource, but he has also given us friends and fellow pastors in our community and in our group of peers, and we need to be able to find someone that we can trust and that we can talk to about these things as well. Don't shoulder all of these things, or else you'll find that the tragic sense of life becomes very difficult to bear. I once heard a statistic that said that the average time of a new pastor in ministry in this decade is 3 years. They come out of Bible college, they get excited for ministry, they jump into ministry, and within 3 years, they wash out of ministry. And we've got to ask ourselves some important questions as counselors. Why is that happening? There must be a common problem, and I don't suspect, or I won't profess to say that I know what all those problems are. I'm sure there are many things that contribute to those. But would those men have stayed, perhaps, if they had a person, a peer pastor who they could talk to, an accountability partner, an accountability friend, even if he lived on the other side of the country, who he could talk to and open up to and express his anguish and what's going on, and perhaps the disappointments of what's happening in his local church, or the fears that he has about his family, his children. We need to have somebody like that in our lives, and I would really encourage you to find someone like that you can really talk to, who can be a source of edification to you and help build you up. So in summary, this fellowship that we have with our friends who are also involved in pastoral care and counseling is incredibly important. Sadly, many pastors are not involved with counseling ministries, and so they cannot always relate to the sadness that comes from being involved with hurting people in that sense. And again, I am hoping and praying that through this course and other courses that are hopefully going to be offered, that more pastors will will take the time and get some training on how to do counseling right so that we can be a real help to people. And right now, because a lot of pastors don't do counseling, perhaps they don't feel like they're well equipped to do it, perhaps they feel like they don't have time to do it, they're missing out on a lot of opportunities to really connect with their people in a very meaningful way. And because a lot of pastors right now are not counseling and don't have counseling ministries, those of us who do may also say that, the fellow down the road can't relate to me because he doesn't do counseling. However, times are changing, and more pastors are seeing the need and receiving training to help through counseling ministry. And even if a pastor does not have a similar ministry to you, the man of God is equipped to be a comfort in a time of sadness. And it's often difficult for one pastor to admit his weakness and sadness to another pastor, but that's just our pride taking control, our pride being in the way of good communication. A continued problem with the tragic sense of life is also the temptation to become isolated. If we give in to this temptation, we begin to feel sorry for ourselves, and we may fall into the trap of seeking sympathy from somebody else, maybe one person in particular. Often that person becomes a person of the opposite sex, and that relation may easily turn into an extramarital affair. So we have to be careful that we guard against this isolationism that happens in a lot of our lives and ministries. And we've seen it, and we've seen the fallout from it before, so we understand what that means. So we got to be careful. We can become isolated from our family, from our friends, and such a separation because of this whole sense of how tragic the world is and how tragic life is. It can lead us into unnecessary grief for ourselves and certainly into sinful situations, which would disqualify us from the ministry and from counseling altogether. So we have to guard ourselves, and one of the ways that we do that is have somebody that you can talk to and share these burdens with so that you're not alone. Now, in summary, recognizing the form of grief that a person is experiencing may help to discern how a person is coping or not coping with their loss. People suffer grief through many different types of circumstance, and each person seems to cope with loss in their own unique way. This section that we're just finishing off has not been intended to be an exhaustive list of each particular type of grief. Rather, it just serves to demonstrate that not every person can be simply placed into a particular mold. Learning to discern the onset of grief and the effect of loss upon an individual is the first step in the process of counseling them through their pain. And it's very important that we be diligent in this.